All right, so we're going to look at the axial skeleton, which is the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. We're going to do a little review. We'll have pictures of the actual models and then pictures from our textbook. Now, before we get started, understand that you have student handouts that have lists of the bones you need to know and the landmarks that are on those bones. And so as we go through, since I'm not able to turn this around, I'm going to look at the bones that you can see that are on here and point out a few things and the landmarks that are shown as we go through. So for instance, it's easy to see, and this is the frontal bone. Now, I am on a laptop, so I don't have a way to really write this out, so a lot of my stuff's going to look very kindergartenish as I'm going through here, but forgive me. So this is the frontal bone. There's no landmarks on the frontal bone you need to know. It's just the frontal bone. Here at the bridge, what we would generally call the bridge of the nose, if I kind of outline where what they call sutures, the joints between the bones are, there are two small bones here, one on this side and one on the other side here, and they are referred to as nasal bones. Now, they are facial bones. Now, as we go through, I'll kind of refer to facial bones and cranial bones as I'm pointing these out. And there's a difference. Cranial bones are any bone that has a connection with the cranial cavity. Facial bones are ones that do not. And so the frontal bone is a cranial bone where the nasal bones are not. They are called facial bones. One of the largest facial bones, and I should say the largest one, if I outline its little area here, and there's a suture, and as I go down and around and over, this is the maxilla. The maxilla is, I don't know where that weird line came from, but the maxilla is this bone here, largest of the facial bones, and it has a few landmarks that you can see on this particular picture of it. We'll see some more in another angle. But the landmark here is going to be these little holes right underneath where the eyes would be. Now, the most common name for a hole in a bone is called a foramen, and the area where the eye is called the orbital socket or orbital cavity. And so these are called the infraorbital foramen. Then the under part, so this is the top part of the oral cavity. The bottom part of the oral cavity is this bone here called the maxilla. Now, the maxilla is the only freely movable bone in the skull, and this little area here is called the mental, if you remember from the specific names of the areas of the body. And so I've got two little holes close to the mental, and the holes in the bone are called foramen, so they're called the mental foramen. I want to go back up to the maxilla. I want to point out one other thing here. So besides the little infraorbital foramen, there's a little section here that sticks out. Now, in another view, we're going to see that this little area is a little ridge, a bridge basically, called the zygomatic arch. And so this particular point of the maxilla, and I'm going to point to it here as well, is called the zygomatic process of the maxilla. Now, just like a hole in the bone is generally called a foramen, anytime you have a bone that has something coming off of it, like a little part, that is called, in general, a process. So if I was like a crazy aunt at a family reunion and I could grab somebody's cheek, I could actually pinch this little part here. And that little part, if I was able to look at the maxilla by itself, that would be called the zygomatic process, because it's taking part making up the zygomatic arch. So it's the zygomatic process of the maxilla because it's coming from that bone. Now, some of the other ones you can see here, this part here is the zygomatic bone because it makes up the majority of the zygomatic process. That's why the process is named that. There is a bone right here that you can see, and it's making up a majority of what we refer to as the nasal septum, and it is going to be called the volar bone. Now, this part here is just a little part that we can see. The upper part of the nasal septum is part of a bone called the ethmoid, and that is particularly called the perpendicular plate. Again, that's kind of a hard one to label on anything, but I'm just pointing that out there. It is the upper part of the nasal septum. Now, the nasal septum, in general, because the vulmar is the most easily seen one, the vulmar gets to be named basically the nasal septum. So if you ever hear someone saying they have a deviated septum, it's generally the vulmar bone that they're talking about. Now, on this picture, I'm just going to point out this is a part of the sphenoid, which is a bone we're going to see on the inside of the cranial cavity. And so just to point it out, that you can see it here. Now, the most easily recognizable part and the part with the landmarks in it are going to be seen from the inside of the nasal or the cranial cavity. Inside the nasal cavity, there are these little ridges that come off the edge here. These are called nasal concha, and there's actually a third set, but they're way up here, so you can't really see them on the models. But the nasal concha come off the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, and they're designed to take the air when you breathe it in and cause it to swirl through here, and that causes all of the air to rub against the nasal mucosa, which is going to help filter it. So I'm going to look at the next slide. This is going to probably be the picture of the skull from the book. And so this has all of those parts kind of labeled, and now I'm not going to go through each one of them in here, but I wanted to point that out because a lot of the quizzes and questions, probably on the practical, are going to come from these pictures. So again, some of the things we haven't looked at, we will talk about the sutures. You couldn't see the parietal bone on that picture. I didn't point out the ethmoid bone. Certain things that are on here because you can see them on the picture, but I'm going to have a picture that's got things labeled as we go through. Remember that your student handouts have names for all the bones you need to know and the particular parts of them that you need to be able to name. For instance, this orbital fissure is not anything that's on there. All right, so just kind of pointing that out. So as we move along, we look at a different view, and I just want to use this one in particular to point out this bone right here, the one that's right here. All right, so this is called the lacrimal bone, and I don't know if anyone knows this or not. If you do, that's great, but that bone, the lacrimal bone, the word lacrimal means tears, and so you have a gland that secretes tears. It's called the lacrimal gland, and as those tears work across your eye, as they clean it, they are drained through a little foramen right here, a little canal, and this is the lacrimal canal, the tear duct, basically. And so I always point that out because it is in this bone. And so this bone is called the lacrimal bone. So that little duct is like a big neon sign saying, hey, this is the lacrimal bone. Now, a couple other things that you can see here. Now, you can also see this is the maxilla, the infraorbital foramen, zygomatic bone, blah, blah, blah. So, but the other thing on here that you can see, this little part here, this little hole, we're going to look at from another view. This is the optic canal. This is where the optic nerve enters into the cranial cavity. But again, just pointing that out, but we're going to see it more definitely on the inside. Now, this is a picture that kind of shows it, just pointing out some of the things in there. The real big one is the lacrimal bone. On this picture, you can't see the foramen, and so that makes it a little bit difficult. Now, looking at the skull from the side, you can still see the nasal bone. You can still see the maxilla and the mandible. You got the mental foramen. You got the frontal bone. Now, some of the other bones you can't see, you didn't see on that first picture, this is called the parietal bone. Now, there are two parietal bones, and they make up the majority of the cranial cavity. Parietal means cavity. That's why when you looked at the membranes, you had a visceral membrane that's on the organ. Viscera is the name for organ. Parietal means cavity, so the parietal membrane lines the cavity. Since this makes up the majority of the cranial cavity, this is called the parietal bone, the cavity. Now back here is a bone called the occiput. I'm going to kind of highlight where the dividing line is in this. It goes behind this big bump and underneath. The occiput we're going to see much more clearly from a different view when we're looking at the underside of the skull. Now this bone here is called the temporal bone. Now the temporal bone has several of the landmarks that you'll need to know. You can see them all on this picture, some better than others. First and foremost is this one. This part here is a little ridge that is sticking off of the temporal bone. And so if I was able to take the temporal bone and remove it, you would see this little thing hanging out on its own. Be like I'm a little teapot short and stout, right? It's this little ridge, this little arm that's coming off of there. And since I said an extension from a bone is generally called a process, and this entire arch as it goes around is called the zygomatic arch, this particular part is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And so I have way over here, and you can't really see it. You can kind of sneak a peek of the little dividing line there. That is the zygomatic process of the maxilla. Here's the dividing line here. This is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now the other three, there's two pretty easily seen bumps. Now one of them is a very sharp thing. It looks like a little vampire tooth. That's called the styloid process of the temporal bone. Now it is highly important to remember to put the temporal bone, especially on this, because there's other styloid processes. Then we have this large bump here. This is called the mastoid process. If you feel behind your ear, you'll feel a big bump there. That is the mastoid process. So we've got this more medial one, this more internal vampire tooth looking thing called the styloid process, and then this big bump just behind the ear called the mastoid process. And then we have this little indentation. So we've talked about two important terms to know. One of them is a hole in a bone is called a foramen in general, and that an extension off a bone is called a process. Now the other two words that would be really important to know is condyle and fossa. In general, and I'm going to draw this in the middle of the skull so you can kind of see it. In general, I'm going to have a bone that will have this raised part, that is called a condyle, and then on the other part, I'm going to have a bone that is going to fit into a little indentation of the other bone. This forms a joint, and this part is called a fossa. So if you look here, I've got this little part coming from the mandible that comes up, and then I've got this rounded part on the temporal bone. So this is referring to this part. So this particular thing is called the mandibular fossa, because it's the fossa for the mandible. And again, we'll see it in a different angle on another slide. And so those are the bones that I would highlight on this picture. And then I'm going to have another picture of the stuff from the book. And again, there are some things on here that are not labeled, or that might be labeled that aren't on your student handouts, and do not worry about those. But this is a good overview of them. This is looking from above. This is now looking at things called sutures. Now, sutures are joints of the cranial bones, of the bones of the skull, and as you can kind of see, they look like crazy stitching right here. So there are 4 sutures that you need to know. You can only see 3 of them on this picture. All 4 of them are associated with the parietal bone. So this bone right here and right here are the parietal bones. This is the frontal bone, and back here is the occiput, right? So the suture here, this is called the coronal suture because it is named for the plane. Remember, the coronal or frontal plane divides the body anterior or posterior. And so since this divides this section between anterior and posterior, it is called the coronal suture. Then this one also keeps with the name for planes, and it is called the parietal, or sorry, it is called the sagittal suture. It's between the two parietal bones. So the plane that divides the body right and left is called the sagittal plane. And so since this runs along the sagittal plane, it's called the sagittal suture. So the other two have odd names. Now, the one back here, or when I say odd names, they're not named for the plane. The one in the back, the easiest way to remember it is that it's called the lambdoidal suture. The easiest way that I've found to remember it is if you've ever heard of a car called a Lamborghini, the Lamborghini has its engine in the trunk, in the back. So you can remember lambdoidal or Lamborghini, the engine in the back. Now there's one that, again, you can't see off to the side between the parietal bone and the temporal bones, and it is called the squamosal suture. And so at this point, you should have looked at the stratified squamous epithelium. And if you look at the stratified squamous epithelium, and this is the outer surface, it's got this wavy basement membrane all through there, right? And so when you're looking at this suture, you will see that it looks very similar to that. So those are the sutures. This common one's the picture of them, all right? It's not really showing a whole lot of the stuff, it's showing the bones, but this would be the sagittal suture, this is the lambdoidal suture, and then this is the part of the squamosal suture. Now this is looking at the inside of the cranial cavity, and there are two bones that you want to know here. I'm going to outline the first one. It looks like a little bat through here. Now I'm going to actually extend onto that bat image. I'm going to erase this real quick, and I'm going to tell you, to me it looks like this Muppet face. If I kind of circle this and look at it, it looks like a little like crazy Muppet. I've got two eyes here and then a little mouth right here. And so I'm going to draw some teeth in it. No, I'm just kidding. These two areas where the mouth is and where the little eyes are important things to know. But this entire bone is called the sphenoid. This is the one I showed you in the posterior part of the orbital cavity. But this is the easiest way to see it. And it's two main landmarks that you need to know. The first one is this little part, the part that kind of looks like a little mouth. This is called the sella turcica. God, I went to a little brain freeze right there. The sella turcica. The sella turcica is named that because they thought it looked like a Turkish saddle. If I was looking at it from the side, it would look like this little indentation. And this is how, people in the Middle East, they'll have these saddles that have big ridges in the front and back because you're riding camels and they're wobbling back and forth. And so they called this a Turkish saddle. And the name is sella turcica. So just for a little FYI, this is where your pituitary gland sits. The pituitary gland, you'll learn when you get into the nervous system, in the endocrine system, it's the master gland of the body. It controls most of the other endocrine glands. And it's so important, it's got its own little saddle. Now these two little parts, which I said look to me like the eyes of the Muppet, those are little holes that are the optic canal. We looked at this again in the posterior part of the orbital cavity, the little hole where the cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, comes in. This is a picture kind of showing them. This purple is, again, and I forgot something on the first slide, that last slide. I'm upset with myself. This is the bone called the sphenoid, and right above the sphenoid is this little area. This is the tip of a bone called the ethmoid bone, and I forgot to go over it on this last one. I'm going to kind of just use it on this picture. I'm so sorry about that. There is a little ridge right in the middle of this that's raised up, and then little indentations on either side of it. And now what this is the very uppermost part of your nasal cavity. And so in the middle of your nasal cavity, like we looked at just a minute ago, is a nasal septum, it's called, a wall between the right and left portion of it. And so this is looking at it from the attic view. I'm looking down. This is the top part of your nasal septum. And on this particular view, it is called the crista galla, which is a name that means the crown of the rooster. So if you've got a little, and that's a bad rooster drawing, but it'll have this little thing on the top of it like that. And so that's what they said it looked like, and it kind of does. And it's the ridge of it. It's actually the very topmost part of the nasal septum. Now the other part here on either side of this, and you can kind of see it's kind of porish, it's got these little holes in it filled with pores. This is called the cribriform plate. And what happens in this area is that the nerve, your olfactory nerve, your sense of smell, comes out here and it lays right in these little areas. And so it sends out its little receptors through all those little holes into the upper part of the nasal cavity, and it's sensing, it's monitoring all the chemicals that you're breathing in. And so when you're driving down to Georgetown, when you get close to that paper mill, it lets you know you're getting there. Now, I was told when I was in school that you could remember that you could smell what's on your plate because it would have to go through the cribriform plate. So that's how I remembered that was the cribriform plate. And the crista gallo is the ridge in the middle. So the cribriform plate is on either side, and the crista gallo is in the middle. Now, that is the way to see the ethmoid bone. All right. Now we're looking at the underside of the skull, and so here we see this, as I outline here, is the best way to see what we looked at the very first one called the occiput. Right? It's a big bone that covers the underside of the skull. Now, first of all, it has a very easy to see landmark. This big area, this big opening here, is called the foramen magnum. I've heard some people call it the magnum foramen, and I think that that's acceptable. But the correct term is foramen magnum, I believe, and I could be wrong. So anyway, foramen means hole in a bone, magnum means big. All right, so this is the big hole in the bone. The really significant thing about this is the dividing line between the spinal cord and the brain stem. Once the spinal cord enters into here, it is then called the brain stem, or look the other way, once the brain stem exits here and gets past this, it is called the spinal cord. On either side of the foramen magnum, and it's hard to see on this picture, are little raised areas, and these are called occipital condyles. This is going to sit on the first bone of the vertebral column. Now, as we look at this, you can't see it on this picture, but it's pretty easy to see on the models when you're looking at it. Now, if I'm looking at it this way underneath, there's a little vampire tooth here. That's called the styloid process of the temporal bone. This is the mastoid process. This little indentation you can kind of see here is the mandibular fossa. Then I've got this little part, this little ridge that comes out here, and that is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Then this is a little outline of the suture or the joint. This part right here and this part right here belong to the maxilla. So these are referred to as the zygomatic process of the maxilla. Now, while we're talking about the maxilla, I want to talk about this part. So the maxilla makes up the majority of what we refer to as the hard palate. So the roof of your mouth has a hard and soft palate. If you run your tongue along it, you can feel that it's hard bone for a while, and then it becomes soft tissue. Well, there's a little dividing line here. This bone here is called the palatine bone because it makes up the back part of the hard palate. This entire area here, because it's coming from the maxilla, this is called the palatine process of the maxilla. It is a relatively thin, so if I was looking at the skull from sideways, it is a relatively thin area that's going to divide the oral cavity below it and the nasal cavity above it. And so it's this little plate that extends back, so it's called the palatine process of the maxilla. Now, in the palatine process of the maxilla, there's a little hole right behind here. These first four teeth are called incisors. A hole in a bone is called a foramen, so this is called the incisive foramen. Now, the last thing I'm going to point out here is probably the one that's the hardest to really grasp, and I'm going to kind of try and erase some stuff here so I can get focused on it, so to speak. So we've got this arch, this zygomatic arch, and we looked at the beginning part, the maxilla, and the ending part from the temporal bone. So we said that those were called zygomatic processes of their specific bone. So this one up here, right here, this is the zygomatic process of the maxilla. The one that's extending here is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So we've got this one in the middle that is coming from the zygomatic bone. Now, if you were being logical, it would be the zygomatic process of the zygomatic bone, but they didn't want to name it that because I think they were just worried it was going to have just kind of be too zygomatic-ish, I guess. But we named this now, or I should say they, because I didn't have a part in it and I won't take credit for it. They named this the temporal process of the zygomatic bone because it's basically the one that is joining the temporal bone. So the three parts of this little ridge, I've got one, I'm going to do this on the left side. The first one is the zygomatic process of the maxilla. The second one is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And then the third one and last one is going back to the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And I know that's kind of confusing, and I'm sorry it's like that. This kind of shows it as it's going through here. Some of them's not, not really named. Again, remember there's a lot of things on this picture that you are not responsible for. But this is the picture that the book has, and so there's going to be parts of this that you probably will be able or have to name on either the practical or on quizzes. Now we look at the vertebral column. So the skull sits on a column of 24 movable bones with a base called the sacrum. And so the average vertebrae is going to have a couple of parts to it that you need to know. And so the first part is this largest bony part here. This is called the body of the vertebrae. Remember, do not just call it the body. You've got to be specific, the body of the vertebrae. Then we have this hole in the middle, and that is called the vertebral foramen. Now, this is where your spinal cord hangs out. This is where it extends down through. Now, I've got this one part, this process that extends backwards, and I've got two that go off to the side. The ones that go off to the side are named transverse processes. This is because you've got a plane that is named the transverse or horizontal plane. It goes out to the side, so that's what they're named after. The one that sticks straight back is called the spinous process, and if you feel your back, those are the bumps you feel along your spine. And so I've got a spinous process here, and I've got a temporal process here and here. And these are for muscle attachment so that the muscles can move the bones. And again, so this is the body. So now the last two things we want to look at is the little name for the ridge, the connection between the transverse process and the body, and the name for the connection between the spinous process and the transverse process. So this is called the lamina. The junction between the spinous process and the transverse process is called the lamina. The junction between the transverse process and the body is called the pedicle. Now, when I was in school, mnemonics were a big thing to help remember things in order. So this was some love to play ball. Some love to play ball. And so SLTPB. And hopefully, body's an easy one to remember as it's there. I mean, if you want to come up with your own, that's fine. That's what I used in school to help remember it. And again, there are so many more parts to these that as a chiropractor, I had to remember. These are pretty straightforward. All right, so spinous process, lamina, transverse process, pedicle, body. And then, of course, the vertebral foramen here. So this is a picture showing the same basic things. We'll talk about that. I'll let you look at this to study it. The big thing about the spine is there are 3 sections, and now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if there's a picture on here showing the 3 sections, but it is in your lecture PowerPoints. And you will need to know how many bones are in each section and how to determine which bone you're looking at. And so this is all 3. So I'm going to show you that how to tell what's what, and then I'm going to tell you how many bones are in each section. So there's 2 questions to divide the 3 sections. The 3 sections are cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. All right. Now, cervical vertebrae are the only ones that have these holes in the transverse process. There's a little artery and vein that go up through there, and that's a very important landmark. So the first question you ask yourself are there holes in the transverse processes? If there is, you are looking at cervical vertebrae. You don't have to go any farther. Now, there are 7 cervical vertebrae. If there are no holes in the transverse process, as in these 2, you know then that we don't have a cervical vertebrae, and it's either thoracic or lumbar. At that point, you look at the spinous process. The spinous process in the transverse spine, or in the thoracic spine, is very angled. This isn't even sitting right because it can't sit right because this goes back so much at so much of an angle. So kind of looks like a little raptor claw. So it's like kind of coming at you. So if the spinous process is angled, it's thoracic. If it is relatively straight back, you can kind of see it goes straight along the bottom of the body. If I did that on that one, you'd see how angled it is. If it's relatively straight back, it's lumbar. And I've heard people try to use things like the cervical looks like a monkey, the thoracic looks like a giraffe, and the lumbar looks like a rhinoceros, or this is big, small, or, I think those two questions are the easiest ones to separate them. Now, in the thoracic spine, when the lower thoracic vertebrae get closer to the lumbar, there are some, it gets closer to see, it's harder to tell by the spinous process. But at that point in time, if you're going to get that specific, there's other things you would look at. Now, the thoracic spine has 12 vertebrae, and the lumbar has 5. All right, so cervical has 7, thoracic has 12, lumbar has 5. There is a little saying that helps people to remember this. It's not necessarily true, but you have breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5, and that helps you organize those. Now, the vertebrae are named, so in the cervical spine you have 7, and they're generally named C1 as the most superior, and as it goes down, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, and then at that point it transitions to thoracic, and then you have T1 through T12, and then it transitions to lumbar, L1 to L5. So if you've ever heard someone talk about they had low back problems in their L5 disc, whatever, that's what they're talking about. Now, the big thing is in the cervical spine, the top 2 are special. All right, so this is another overview of the differences of the vertebrae. This is a picture. I should have had a larger one showing this. Cervical, this is thoracic, this is lumbar. Now going to the top 2 cervical vertebrae, they are very special, and you don't call them just C1, which is what this one is, and C2. All right. C1 has a couple of unique things in it. It does not have a vertebral body, and it does not have a spinous process. Right? It is one big hoop, and this is what your skull sits on. It is called Atlas. In mythology, there is a Greek titan that holds up the world named Atlas. The Greeks are the ones that named these. So they named this bone Atlas because it holds up your head. In other words, it holds up your world. C2 is called Axis. And I'll tell you why. This little thing here, this is called a dens. The dens actually fits into this little spot here, and the majority of your rotational movement. So if you shake your head no, or rotate your head no back and forth, the majority of that movement is coming between C2 axis and C1 atlas at this joint. And since in science, any point of rotation is generally called an axis, that's why they call it this. You can see that both of them still have their little transverse foramen, so you can definitely tell that are cervical bones. But you cannot call these C1 and C2. This is axis. C1 is atlas. C2 is axis. And on axis, you definitely need to know that this little landmark is called the dens. And this picture shows it as well. Then we get to a real freaky bone called the sacrum. The sacrum is kind of crazy, and at the end of the sacrum is another little set of bones called the coccyx. So the sacrum is 5 bones that have been fused together. They form the base of the vertebral column, and they are the connection of what we'll look at next week in the appendicular skeleton of the pelvic girdle. So it looks kind of weird. I always say it looks like a little prehistoric face mask or some kind of mastodon skull. And then this little guy right here that hangs off, the coccyx, which we commonly refer to the tailbone. If you have ever hurt that, you will know that it is weird how something so small can be so painful if it is damaged. And then you got to carry around the donut of shame when it's broken because you can't sit down, and it makes it matters even worse. So that's the sacrum and the coccyx. Another picture of them. And then we talk about the thoracic cavity, the thoracic cage. Don't worry about these pictures of these bones for this right now because that's not part of it. This is the thoracic cage, your rib cage. Just a quick FYI, this bone right here is called the hyoid bone. Just a little brief FYI, the hyoid bone is the only bone that does not articulate with another bone. It is for muscle attachment and swallowing. Now, I want to go back to the thoracic cage, and on this one, I'm going to use the picture that we have. So this is the picture from the textbook. So we have 12 pair of vertebrae, and they come around, and most of them join this thing called the sternum. The sternum is that what we commonly refer to as the breastbone. Right? So the sternum is this little part in the middle. Now the sternum is made up of 3 bones. The top one is called the manubrium. The middle one is called the body of the sternum. Again, we have other bodies, so remember the body of the sternum. And then this last part called the xiphoid process. Right? The manubrium, the joint, the area where the manubrium and the body meet, is called the sternal angle or sternal notch. And this is kind of an important landmark to know because this is where rib 2 joins the sternum, and the intercostal space, anything between bones, is called intercostal. So the intercostal space here is where you would put the stethoscope to listen to 2 of the heart valves. And so it's a very big, important landmark to kind of know. Now, going back to the ribs, like I said, there are 12 pair of ribs, and each thoracic vertebrae will have a pair of ribs coming off of it. So you should be able to remember that there are 12 pair of ribs and there's 12 thoracic vertebrae. They tie together. Now, they are organized in a classification that is first talking about whether the rib has a direct connection to the sternum. And so the first 7 ribs have direct connections to the sternum, so they are referred to as true ribs. The last 5 do not, so they're called false ribs. Now, the top 3 false ribs will fuse together and then kind of hitch a ride with rib 7. But the bottom 2 never connect. And so even though they are false ribs, they are more specifically referred to as floating ribs. So the bottom 2 ribs are floating ribs, and as you can kind of see, they never come around. They just kind of hang out. Basically, they're there to help protect the kidneys. And so this is the axial skeleton.